Good afternoon, everyone. I am Madeline Carillo Burhami, one of the presenter in our group, which is to report the assigned task, secondary sources. What is secondary sources? Secondary sources are materials made by people long after the events being described had taken place to provide valuable interpretations or historical events. Secondary sources are works that analyze, assess, or interpret an historical event, era, or phenomenon, generally utilizing primary sources to do so. It often offers a review or a critique. It can include books, journal articles, speeches, reviews, research reports, and more. When we talk about secondary sources, most of the time we are referring to the published scholarship on a subject rather than supplementary material like bibliographies, encyclopedias, handbooks, and so forth. These supplementary materials are sometimes referred to as tertiary sources. Secondary sources are described, discuss, interpret, comment upon, analyze, evaluate, summarize, and process primary sources. A secondary source is generally one or more steps removed from the event or time period and are written or produced after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. It often lacks the freshness and immediacy of the original material. On occasion, secondary sources will collect, organize, and repackage primary source information to increase usability and speed of delivery, such as an online encyclopedia. Like primary sources, secondary materials can be written or non-written. In generally speaking, secondary sources are written well after the events that are being researched. However, if an individual writes about events that he or she experienced firsthand many years after that event occurred, it is still considered a primary source. That's all, and thank you.
Okay, so this is Baby Jean Caminero. So let's proceed to the secondary source characteristics. So the first characteristics of secondary source is well-researched, vetted, or empirically tested. It means that the secondary source contain research findings and purpose of studies that already done by other people in some subjects. From this, it is important as it provides good overviews of a subject, particularly if we need to find about an area that new for us. Second, provides an analysis of other sources. It means that the secondary sources provides an analysis of other sources so that we able to know the background information as well as having as much knowledge as possible about the text or events that we like to search. Third one is adds value to one or more primary sources. It means that secondary sources are one step removed from primary sources, though they often quote or otherwise use primary sources. They cover the same topic but add layer of interpretation and analysis. So, that's the end of my part, and now allow me to welcome Miss Merjin Kariman for the continuation.
Okay, thank you, Miss Bibi Jean Caminero. And once again, I am Mary Jean Kariman, and here are the other characteristics of secondary sources. It often written from third-person point of view. Secondary sources often written from third-person point of view, which the narrator exists outside the events of the story and relates the actions of the characters by referring to their names or by the third-person pronouns he, she, or they. Another characteristics, it often contains quotations from eyewitness. Secondary sources often contain quotations from eyewitness because it provides second-hand information and commentary which it describes, interprets, or synthesizes primary sources. There should be quotations because it is created by someone and it is not your own article or sources. Another characteristics, it include a work cited. Secondary sources include a work cited which admire the original author, and it is generally acceptable within academic writing, as long as these citations are kept to a minimum. That's all. Thank you.
Secondary sources offer an analysis, interpretation, and early statement of primary sources and are considered to be persuasive. They often involve generalistic, synthesis, interpretation, commentary, or evaluation in attempt to convince the reader of the creator's argument. They often attempt to describe or explain primary sources. Here are some examples of secondary sources. First, edited works, books and articles that interpret or review, histories, literary criticism and legislation, political analysis, commentaries, journal articles that comment or analyze research, dictionaries, dissertation, newspaper, editorial, or opinion pieces. That's all.
There are examples of secondary sources, the books, articles, and documentaries that synthesize information on a topic, the synopses and descriptions of artistic works, encyclopedias and textbooks that summarize information and ideas, reviews and essays that evaluate or interpret something. When you cite a secondary source, it's usually not to analyze it directly. Instead, you'll probably test its arguments against new evidence or use its ideas to help formulate your own. Anything that summarizes, evaluates, or interprets primary sources can be a secondary source. If a source gives you an overview of background information or presents another researcher's ideas on your topic, it is probably a secondary source.
So again, good afternoon everyone. I'm Maris Villamia. The next topic is about the advantages and disadvantages of secondary sources, and I'll be the one to discuss the advantages of it. So why use secondary sources? So the following are some of the advantages of secondary sources. First, secondary sources can provide analysis, synthesis, interpretation, or evaluation of the original information. So secondary sources often attempt to describe or explain primary sources. Like for example, if we talk about artists like mga painters baron, na yung mga authors that write articles about the work of a certain known painter. So they try to evaluate each detail sa painting or interpret sa meaning anang certain artwork niya. Also, they may provide a biography of that artist, which we considered as a secondary sources. And the most important feature of secondary sources is that they offer an interpretation of information gathered from primary sources. Next, or second, secondary sources provide a variety of expert perspectives and insights. So secondary sources are best for uncovering background or historical information about a topic and broadening your understanding of a topic. As what has been discussed, there are many examples of secondary sources. We have the scholarly or popular books and journal articles, criticisms, reviews, commentaries, and many others. So, kani sila mo'y makahatag sa mga researches og new idea and better understanding about the topic. It will also expose them to others' perspectives, interpretation, and conclusion. And it can also support the research studies with the citation of reliable sources. However, it is better to critique an original information source or the primary source if you plan to reference it in your work. And the third one is researching secondary sources is more efficient than planning, conducting, and analyzing certain primary forms of research. So, secondary sources are often clearer or more comprehensive, putting an individual study into into a larger historical context. So if you do a research is usually dili ra man jud usa ka source ang kuan natog information, right? And we need man jud nato na mangutingkay pa og mini information to have a reliable source. So we need to scan or review many sources to choose the more confirmed information. So isa pa, secondary sources are easy to find, reliable, save time, provide fast information, and involve low cost in comparison to primary sources. Each of these factors is extremely important for a researcher. So that would be all. Thank you for listening, and now let's proceed to the disadvantages of secondary sources, which will be reported by Roslyn Caminero.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I am Roslyn M. Caminero, and for today's video, I'll be sharing with you the disadvantages in using secondary sources. Since we all know that there's a lot of advantages to using secondary sources, but we must be aware of the disadvantages as well. So for today, I just outlined 3 disadvantages of secondary sources. So let's have first. People who create secondary sources were not there when the events happened, so the information can sometimes be distorted. In other words, sometimes information may not depict the actual occurrence or even 100% accurately. It is a second-hand information and may not be reliable due to various interpretations. So their experiences and biases will color how the information is presented. So as such, secondary sources are unreliable as primary points of evidence. Next is their reliability and validity are open to question, and often they do not provide exact information. Yes, this is mainly because the secondary data sources are not regulated and are subject to personal bias. Also, the data may be biased and it is hard to know if the information was collected is really accurate. So they may have inaccurate conclusions as fact because as bias may causes false conclusions and it is potentially misleading. Next is secondary sources are not necessarily focused on your specific topic. So you may have to dig to find applicable information. So it means that the information may be colored by the researcher's own bias or the faulty approach. Also, the secondary sources can become outdated. So we may encounter some difficulty in obtaining the specific information to our needs. In other words, the data was not gathered for the specific purpose the firm needs, or it is not relevant to the original context. So the information may be outdated, therefore there is an inaccuracy. Sources is collected in the past, so it means it might be out of date. So the issue can be crucial in many different situations. Therefore, we must be aware of the disadvantages in using secondary sources in order for us to set our limits and boundaries, especially when we acquire different kinds of informations coming from different kinds of resources. I think that could be all, everyone, about the disadvantages in using secondary sources. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless us always.